We're going to start in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We're still looking at Solomon, probably in his older age, looking back over life, talking about some of the things that were challenging to him, some of the things that he observed that he counts as being vanity or being useless, things that he tried, things that he thought might be the answer, but in the end ended up not being as fruitful as he had hoped. We're going to look at 4 or 5 things that he brings up, and I think probably all of us will have some experience with all of these items, things that Solomon and we have in common. The first one is oppression. Chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressor, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Have you ever had a day that you felt that way? You look at what people are doing to other people and you say, well, can't someone intervene and stop that? And in the United States, we have a heritage of trying to intervene and undo things that are happening around the world to try to fix things. And a lot of times it's not necessarily our fight, and we get into those quarrels and those questions among ourselves as to whether we ought to be there in the first place. The oldest one I can remember, of course, would be about Vietnam, right? Do we really belong there? Is it really our fight? Do we need to keep on doing that? More in later years, well, what about ISIS? What about Kuwait? What about Iraq? You know, is that really our fight? So we're often at odds with each other about whether we should intervene and whether we should try to stop the oppressor. But on a worldwide scale, there are people who spend their lives oppressing other people. And you look at the plight of these folks, and they don't have anybody that can fix the problem for them. And many people are born, live, and die in systems that are heavily weighted against them, and they have nothing that they can do about it. He mentions twice this idea of they don't have a comforter. They don't have somebody that can intervene to give them aid. Is there a way that we can, knowing what we know more than what Solomon knew, is there a way that we can come to peace with the fact that that happens to some people? Think about how strong Hitler was. He comes in on the heels of a terrible economic not a downturn. They were just you could go through the streets of Munich and pick up as many Deutschmarks as you could carry, and you still couldn't buy a loaf of bread. So he and his party come to power because they want to bounce Germany back, right? Well, in the meantime, he and those who work with him oppress other people to the tune of several million folks that are murdered under his regime. He died reportedly at his own hand. Right? If he killed himself in that bunker, then that means he chose the way he lived, he chose the way he governed, and he chose the way he died. Is there anyone who can do anything about that situation? God can. Right? He will be judged. Right? And for as much power as he had on earth, he will have none of it when he stands before the great judge. There's no way of escape. Right? Later on, you run into a guy named Pol Pot in Cambodia. One of his, I'm more familiar, it hits closer to home when I think about him, because one of his criteria was that he didn't like people with glasses, and he didn't like people who were instructors, teachers, right? So I was on the hit list. He didn't like ministers, so me and Paul would not have got along very well, and I would have been dead in a heartbeat. What can you do about all the millions of people that Paul killed of his own countrymen? You can't help them, right? They had no comforter, but at least he will answer for the things that he did. There is one stronger than anything that mankind might do. But as far as Solomon was concerned, it was better to be dead than to be alive and be oppressed. And more than that, it would be better to have never been born at all. Have you heard that as an argument of why people don't have children? I don't want to have a child and bring them into the world as it is. Well, there's so many wonderful things in the world. There's a relationship with Christ that we can enjoy life with a comforter, right? We have the Holy Spirit as our comforter. We have the Lord as our Savior. So we've got great stuff in the here and now. But it's true that even Christians are oppressed sometimes and can't do anything about it in the physical realm. But again, our God is still the one true God. Look at verse 4. I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. Remember last week he talked about how all the work that you do under the sun is vanity, because when you get finished, there's more work to do, and no matter how much you earn from all the work that you do, you're going to leave it to somebody else, and they may be a fool. So he's already decided that doing all that hard work may be vanity, but now he says the real reason that people work hard is they're jealous of what somebody else has. So I want what they have, so I have to work hard enough to get one of my own or to take away what they have. So all toil and achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. So basically Solomon says, why don't you just be satisfied with less? Why work hard to have more when you can just learn to be satisfied with less? We know people like that, don't we? Sometimes we want to accuse them of being lazy. Well, if you work harder, you could have more stuff, and you could have a nicer car and a better house and feed your family better. Solomon says, well, when you get right down to it, they're not envious of what somebody else has, so they're not motivated by that, and they're not working themselves to death to have more. They're just enjoying what they already have. There's got to be a point at which we draw the line and say, I'm satisfied with this. And I guess we all eventually do. You can drive yourself crazy trying to find something else. One handful with tranquility is better than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Learn to be content with little rather than striving for much. And this is honestly a Jesus concept. Right? When I first really started paying attention to the Sermon on the Mount, it would have been after I was more grown up, teens, early 20s probably, when you start actually listening to what it says. And Jesus says, stop working so hard, stop worrying about so much, God will take care of you. Right? The Sermon on the Mount. Why do you worry about tomorrow? Tomorrow will take care of itself. Every day has enough trouble of its own. So we have that concept from Jesus. Be thankful for the handful that you have. Don't tear yourself up worrying about having two handfuls. So it's a Jesus concept, but it's tough in America, because in America you can have whatever you want to work hard enough to get. Is that really a true statement, by the way? Not necessarily. I mean, you can do better here than you could do in a lot of places, but there are a lot of us that have a head start, and we can probably do more and get more than other folks. But Jesus says, don't let stuff be the guiding light. Don't let things be the thing that drives you. So it is a Jesus concept that Solomon brings up here. Look at verse 7. We'll put this under the heading of alone is bad. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man who was all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. We've known people like this, right? The old guy who was filthy rich, but didn't have any friends and didn't have any family, and so he just kept having money, and he was never part of the gathering, never part of the community. He was just that rich guy. And then when he passes away, you have to figure out what to do with all the stuff, and he never really enjoyed anything. Solomon says, here I am. I'm extraordinarily wealthy, one of the most wealthy people that ever lived. And he's finally beginning to see that if you don't have somebody to share it with, it's really kind of meaningless. That having things is better when you have people to share those things with. And so in his old age, he's beginning to catch a glimpse of that. Now look at, this is a more famous passage beginning in verse 9. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Right? It's true. Right? If you have a friend, if you have a companion, somebody that you can be with that will help you back up, you're miles ahead of the game. I went and looked up the quote, and this is from Margaret Mead. Now, those of you that are a little bit older may know who Margaret Mead is. She was an anthropologist, did most of her main work between the 40s and the early 70s. And she said a lot of stuff that I can't agree with, a lot of things that about sexuality in particular that she worked on. But as far as her understanding of how humans interact with each other, she had some pretty interesting things to say. This is what she said. They asked her what she would consider to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. She said the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur, that's a thigh bone, that had been broken and healed. Now think about it a minute. In ancient society, you've got a broken leg, you can't run. You're in a hostile environment. You can't walk, you can't get to the house, you can't get to the water, you can't get to food, you can't get away from wild animals, and yet your femur heals. Why does it heal? Somebody took care of you. Right? So she says the first indication that there was real civilization was that somebody got injured in a way that could have cost them their life, but somebody else took care of them. And so Solomon says if there's two of you and one of you falls down, the other one can pick you up. It's kind of the opposite of that old joke, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. This is, I'm going to pick you up and we're going to go together. Verse 11, if two lie down together, they can keep warm. But how can one keep warm by themselves? Right? David in his old age, he says, I want you to find me somebody that can go to bed with me, not for sex, but for warmth. I just can't ever get warm anymore. And so they go and they find him a young lady who stays with him and is kind of his companion, nursemaid, bed warmer for the rest of his life. I wonder if Solomon thought about her when he was writing that down. Two people can keep warm if they stay together. And then verse 12, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. That one I've heard since I was a little bitty boy. People have, you've never heard that one? That a strand of 3 is not easily broken. So if you can get a group of people together that are in agreement, then they can work together and hold together. I think probably the way it was most often shared was in devotionals or in sermons to say that we need each other in the church. Right? If you're by yourself and you're tempted or you're oppressed in some way because of your affiliation with the Lord, it's tough to be faithful. But if there's you and somebody else, then the two of you can stand firm together. And if there's a third person, right, then you've really got a group that can stand firm and be strong together. I think about small congregations around the world that are just, there's only a handful of folks. And as they are sticking together and hanging together in those small groups, that, you know, God is blessing them and they're blessing each other just by being there, by knowing that somebody else cares about what's happening to them. Look at chapter 5, verse 1. This one is probably as New Testament. There's a lot of quotes from the New Testament that go side by side with this one, from both Jesus and his little brother James. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know when they're wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, fear God. So, I guess in our situation, enter into worship with respect for God. That this is not a casual gathering. This is not a casual game that we play. I worry sometimes about modern churches and the way they approach worship. It's so much about them and not so much about God. So, you know, what's my experience? How much am I enjoying what I'm getting, and what's going on in my religious walk? And they don't ever quite get around to honoring God. He's in heaven, you're on earth. Let your words be few. You know, you don't know all that you think you know. And then he talks about making vows. Again, Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, keep your vows that you make to the Lord. Where was it said? Right there. Solomon said it, right? If you make a vow to the Lord, you better keep it. He goes on to say, don't tell the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Oops, I was just kidding. You know, I realized I said I was going to send a goat for sacrifice this week, but oops, you know, my bad. Don't promise God something and then back up on your promise. I had a professor once that said the only good thing about a deathbed promise is if you go ahead and die. He said, because when people get better, they forget all about their promises. Right? There are no atheists in foxholes. Right? You're in a foxhole. God, I'll do this. God, I promise that. And then you get out of the foxhole. You survive the war. You get back home. Do you keep the vow that you made when you were in terror in the foxhole? So Solomon talks about it. Jesus talks about it. Jesus says, don't make any vows at all. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. So if you're going to do it, do it. If you're not going to do it, don't make any promises. Just do whatever it is that you want to vow. Forget about the vow. Just go do it. And then, of course, I love Solomon's statement. You know, when the temple messenger shows up, don't go, oops, I was just kidding. I don't really have a goat to share. So again, Solomon is an old man. He's got a lot of wisdom as he's sitting in his rocking chair thinking back over the years. And I wonder how many people he knew that made vows that they didn't keep, and how many people he knew that lived lonely lives where they just worked and worked and worked and worked and ostracized everybody. And then when it came their time to go, they just had nobody there. How many people he knew that were, lone wolves and never had 2 or 3 that walked with them to help them get through life. So lots of great advice in chapters 4 and 5. Any other thoughts about any of that? No? Okay. I'll give you a homework assignment. I want you to think about who they are. That other person, obviously we've got the 2 can stay warm. We can think about our spouses and maybe even brothers and sisters that we were very close to, close friends that, there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. We've got folks like that in our lives. Those 2 or 3, the small groups that helped us remain faithful when we were in the middle of situations where other people were not faithful, other people were not us, and they're saying things, and then all of a sudden this voice from over here speaks the truth, right? You ever been in that case and you wanted to say something and you just couldn't bring yourself to have the courage to speak it out loud, and then somebody else says just what was on your heart, right? 2 or 3 are together. A strand of 3 is hard to break. So lots of things that have happened in our lives, but think about those things a little bit as you ruminate over those passages. Right now, if there's a way that we can help you by way of a public response, we would love to encourage you any way we can as we sing.